Welcome to the ownership revolution. For most of human history, ownership was very, very simple. The ruler, often the king, owned everything. Sometimes they shared some as rewards. Then, personal ownership began. A farmer owned his land. A merchant owned his shop. A family owned its estate. Later still, shareholders owned companies. Companies, often funds, owned the shops and the land. The employees sold their time in exchange for wages. A comparatively strange relationship and certainly more complex, but the idea that one group owns the assets and another works within has been the zeitgeist for a while. If you invest the money, you reap the harvest you have sown. Over the past century, something rather interesting has been happening. Ownership has slowly begun to spread. Perhaps the most famous example in Britain is the John Lewis partnership. John Spaden Lewis seems to have asked himself a philosophical question: why should the people helping to create value not participate more directly in its rewards? At the time, this was a remarkably radical idea. Ownership had traditionally belonged to the people who provided the capital. Employees provided labour and received wages. Owners provided capital and they received profits. But Lewis believed the relationship should be more balanced than that. Agree with his philosophy or not, it raises an interesting question: who should benefit from the value a business creates? This is a question that has become increasingly relevant over the past century. Across society, people have gained a greater voice and greater agency. Employees increasingly expect more than a payslip. Customers influence businesses through reviews, social media, and public feedback. And communities expect organisations to consider their wider impact. Essentially, the people creating value increasingly expect some influence over the systems they participate in. Sharing ownership is one response to that trend. At its heart sits an ethical argument beyond that of whether, as an employee, you should work a job that slowly kills you. The question is, if success is created collectively, should ownership remain centralised? Well, let's look at the mechanism a little by how this might happen. Fairness is rarely enough to change the world, but structures change everything, and this is where employee ownership becomes particularly interesting to me. Founders can spend endless hours discussing culture, accountability, and engagement, yet behaviour rarely emerges from good intentions alone. More often than not, behaviour follows incentives, and incentives are shaped by structure. Change the structure, and behaviour often changes with it. Give someone a salary and they think one way, give them a profit share and they think differently. Give them ownership and they may suddenly notice waste, efficiency, and opportunity in places they previously ignored. It wasn't relevant to them back then. In property, we see similar patterns. Homeowners often maintain homes differently from tenants. Long-term investors make different decisions from short-term traders. A king with descendants acts differently to a politician who could be voted out in a few years. People behave differently when they have a genuine stake in the future. The same principle, of course, exists inside businesses. And interestingly, because of ownership is one of the most powerful structural tools available to a founder, it influences recruitment, it influences retention, it influences decision-making, and it influences culture. And culture, in turn, influences performance. Ownership is not merely about who receives the rewards. It is also about agency, responsibility, and influence over the future. So, what's the practical reality? What began as a philosophical idea became a force for success. Subsequently, it has become a practical solution, and many founders approaching retirement now see employee ownership as a way to preserve culture, protect jobs, and maintain the character of the business, the baby, they spent decades building. Think Riverford, Richer Sounds, Arup, The Entertainer, different industries, different founders, similar conclusion. A business is rarely just an asset. It's a collection of relationships, values, and accumulated trust. Selling to employees offers one way of preserving them. Employee ownership trusts have become particularly popular in the UK for this reason. Rather than employees individually purchasing shares, ownership is transferred into a trust that acts on behalf of the workforce. The result can allow founders to realise value employees to benefit from ownership, and the business can continue to run independently. It's an elegant solution to a challenge many founders eventually face: what happens after I'm gone? Of course, ownership is not a cure. Giving somebody shares doesn't automatically mean that they get judgment, right? Nor does distributing ownership eliminate poor strategy, weak leadership, or difficult decisions. The history of cooperatives, mutuals, and employee-owned businesses contains both remarkable successes and notable failures. Human nature has an irritating habit of surviving every organisational chart that was ever invented. A flawed strategy remains flawed regardless of who owns the shares, and ownership and responsibility are not automatically the same thing. Employee ownership is often discussed as a succession strategy. In reality, I suspect it sits at the intersection of three ideas. First, ethics, a belief that the people helping to create value should participate more directly in it. The second idea is about incentives, an understanding that ownership changes behaviour because structure shapes outcomes. And then the third idea is about legacy, a desire to preserve what has been built beyond the founder's involvement. Whether employee ownership becomes a dominant model remains to be seen. What interests me more is the broader trend beneath it. Ownership itself appears to be evolving. From much of the 20th century, ownership, influence and control were concentrated in relatively few hands. Today, all three are becoming much more distributed. Employees want ownership, customers want a voice, communities want representation, while investors want transparency. If the 20th century was largely concerned with creating wealth, perhaps part of the 21st century will be spent deciding who should own that wealth. For founders, there's an important strategic question. If ownership shapes behaviour, what ownership structure is your business optimised for? Because ownership isn't merely a legal construct, it's a strategic choice. And like most strategic choices, it affects the shape of everything that follows. So our Easter eggs today were Strange Relationship by Prince. What have we got? We had Radiohead, No Surprises. We had Dogs by Pink Floyd. And then lastly we had Think Differently by the Wu-Tang Clan. Hit subscribe and like if you thought the video was worthwhile, and come back next week for more, and adios.